LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom.
And I'm Caleb Bissinger.
And this is The Next Big Idea. Today,
Cal Newport's counterintuitive guide to productivity.
Caleb, it's important to me that you know that I am not someone who puts motivational signs on the wall typically.
Yeah, really? There's not like a hang in there poster with like a cat dangling from a tree above your desk?
Well, I've made an exception, I'll have you know.
Okay.
I currently have in my office a sign above me that says, number 1, do fewer things. Number 2, work at a natural pace. And 3, obsess over quality. Does that sound familiar?
Of course. This is the 3-step solution for accomplishing more without burning out that we learned from Cal Newport, who wrote a book called Slow Productivity, all about how to actually put those 3 steps into action.
Indeed it is. And I have read that book.
Yes, slowly.
Slowly, of course, appropriately. And I had a podcast conversation with Cal, which I relished. And I have been implementing this approach in my life, and I have found it to be a game changer. And it fits, of course, perfectly in my favorite file.
Scientific studies that support the life you want to live anyway. I know the file.
Yes, indeed. I mean, who doesn't want to do fewer things, do them more slowly, with greater attention to making them great?
So how, like on a day-to-day basis, Rufus, how are you actually applying this? Like, what are some examples?
So it's very simple. I'm actually just writing shorter to-do lists in the morning that prioritize the things that really must get done. I'm putting greater focus, more sustained focus on getting those high priority things done and done well.
Do you feel any sense of like guilt? I've struggled with that. Like when you like the feeling of like working slowly on something and taking my time and not racing to get it handed off to someone else. Like I almost feel like I'm failing, or I feel guilty, like I'm not working hard enough. Have you dealt with any of that? Yeah.
Well, I do think that we become addicted to this freneticism. I mean, there is something kind of exhilarating about the freneticism. And this is a point that Cal makes, right? He says that when we take on too many projects, more than we can actually accomplish, it makes us feel important. There's something kind of exciting about that, but we're actually less effective at getting those projects done.
And as a consequence too, I think, right, we actually complete more projects over time if we take on fewer projects to begin with, right?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense when you think about it, but this was novel information for me, and I have just in the last few months since talking with Cal, I've been implementing it, and I think it's really revelatory.
Yeah, I think revelatory for you and for the whole team here at The Next Big Idea, which is why we asked Cal if he would partner with us to make something really cool, something we're calling a Podclass.
I love it.
Which is basically this new kind of content we're experimenting with. It's part podcast, it's part masterclass. It's got sort of great audio bells and whistles. There's archival footage, there's music, but it also has really actionable takeaways that listeners can apply to their own lives. And so we hope that it's this 45-minute long experience that's going to help people get more done, not burn out, feel a sense of accomplishment, a sense of pride.
It accomplished all that for me. I really relished listening to this podcast.
Nice.
And we have a sneak peek here for everyone today. The full podcast is available on Substack. Apparently, I can't say the word Podclass often enough. I really enjoy it.
It's addicting.
And as some of you know, we've launched a new daily Substack. It's called Book of the Day from the Next Big Idea Club. Just Google Book of the Day Substack and it comes right up. Sign up and you'll receive the 5 key insights from a new nonfiction book every day, 5 days per week, the very best books written and read by the authors themselves. On Saturdays, we give you something special each week, and we recently shared this exclusive podcast from Cal Newport. It's only for paying subscribers, and I know many of you already have too many subscriptions. I feel this way, but you might consider this one. It's a daily delivery of superfood for your brain, and it helps support the work that our team is doing here at the Next Big Idea Club which we really appreciate. It's a great community space as well.
Yeah. And one other thing I would just say, one of the plug I'd make for our Substack is like, there's just nothing else like that, it out there, right? Like, yeah. I don't know of any other newsletter that is giving you such high quality, such an interesting and engaging and informative, little doses of superfood every morning. So check it out, bookoftheday.nextbigideaclub.com. And let's take a little listen to this preview of Cal Newport's Podclass.
I can't believe I got you to say superfood for your brain as a tagline, Caleb. I've been working on that one.
I regret it already.
I think you're warming up to it. All right. With no further ado, Cal Newport.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by SAP. SAP Business AI. Embedded across SAP solutions, it drives immediate impact. From Joule, your digital assistant, to AI-powered capabilities portfolio-wide, make confident decisions using your own data. SAP Business AI. Revolutionary technology, real-world results. That's SAP Business AI.
I'm Tomer Cohen, LinkedIn's Chief Product Officer. In my new podcast, Building One, I interview some of the best product builders out there. People at the intersection of dreaming and building and learning. Together, you and I will learn from their experiences. If you're just as curious as I am, follow Building One wherever you listen, and check out the conversation on LinkedIn.
Hi, my name is Cal Newport, and I'm the author of Slow Productivity, The Lost Art of Accomplishment Without Burnout. Early in the coronavirus pandemic, I began to hear a clear message from my readers and podcast listeners. They were increasingly fed up with the idea of productivity altogether. Working from home, their days felt somehow more frantic than before. Online meetings proliferated, email and Slack became hyperactive. There was a sense of drowning in activity combined with the sinking feeling that all of this busyness wasn't actually translating into more results. It became clear to me that something was fundamentally broken about the way we're thinking about productivity and knowledge work. So I set out to figure out what went wrong and how we can fix it. I wrote Slow Productivity to document this adventure. And in this course, I want to share with you the best ideas that I uncovered. John McPhee and the Problem with Productivity. In the summer of 1966, toward the end of his second year as a staff writer for The New Yorker, John McPhee found himself prone on a picnic table under an ash tree in his backyard near Princeton, New Jersey.
I lay down on it for nearly 2 weeks, staring up into branches and leaves, fighting fear and panic, because I had no idea where or how to begin a piece of writing for The New Yorker.
McPhee wasn't new to magazine writing, but the article that immobilized him on his picnic table for 2 weeks that summer was a long story. It was about the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, and it was the most complicated he had yet attempted to write. McPhee spent 8 months researching the topic in the lead-up to his picnic table paralysis, gathering what he later called enough material to fill a silo. He had traveled from his Princeton home down to the Pine Barrens more times than he could easily remember, often bringing a sleeping bag to extend his stay. He had read all the relevant books and talked to all the relevant people. Now that he had to start writing, he felt overwhelmed.
To lack confidence at the outset seems rational to me. It doesn't matter that something you've done before worked out well. Your last piece is never going to write your next one for you.
So McPhee lay on his picnic table, looking up at the branches of that ash tree, trying to figure out how to make this lumbering mass of sources and stories work together. He stayed there on that table for 2 weeks before a solution to his quandary finally arrived. Even after this moment of insight, however, it still took McPhee more than a year to finish writing his article, working in a modest rental office off Nassau Street in Princeton, located above an optometrist shop and across the hall from a Swedish massage parlor. The finished piece would stretch to more than 30,000 words and be divided into 2 parts to appear in 2 consecutive issues of the magazine. It's a marvel of long-form reporting and one of the more beloved entries in McPhee's long bibliography. It couldn't have existed, however, without McPhee's willingness to put everything else on hold and just lay on his back gazing upward toward the sky, thinking hard about how to create something wonderful. When I first encountered the story of John McPhee's long days spent looking up at the leaves in his backyard, I received it nostalgically. A scene from a time long past, when those who made a living with their minds were actually given the time and space needed to craft impressive things. Wouldn't it be nice to have a job like that, where you didn't have to worry about being productive, I thought. But eventually, an insistent realization emerged. McPhee was productive. If you zoom out from what he was doing on that picnic table on those specific summer days in 1966, to instead consider his entire career, you'll find a writer who has, to date, published 29 books, one of which won a Pulitzer Prize and 2 of which were nominated for National Book Awards. He has also penned distinctive articles for The New Yorker for over 5 decades, and through his famed creative nonfiction course, which he has long taught at Princeton University, he has mentored many young writers who went on to enjoy their own distinctive careers, a list that includes Richard Preston, Eric Schlosser, Jennifer Weiner, and David Remnick. There's no reasonable definition of productivity that shouldn't also apply to John McPhee. And yet, nothing about his work habits captures the franticness or busyness that we associate with the idea of productivity today. Maybe it became clear the problem is not with the goal of being productive, but instead with our very definition of productivity itself. This is the central idea of both my book and this course. The relentless overload that's wearing us down is generated by a belief that good work requires increasing busyness, faster responses to email and chats, more meetings, more tasks, more hours. But when we look closer at this premise, as we'll do next, we'll fail to find a firm foundation for this idea. The rise of pseudo-productivity. In most every area of our economy, not only is productivity a well-defined concept, but it's often central to how work unfolds. Indeed, much of the astonishing economic growth fueling modernity can be attributed to a more systematic treatment of this fundamental idea. Early uses of the term productivity can be traced back to agriculture, where its meaning is straightforward. For a farmer, the productivity of a given parcel of land can be measured by the amount of food the land produces. This ratio of output to input provides a compass of sorts that allows farmers to navigate the possible ways to cultivate their crops. Systems that work better will produce measurably more bushels per acre. This use of a clear productivity metric to help improve clearly defined processes might sound obvious, but the introduction of this approach enabled explosive leaps forward in efficiency. As the Industrial Revolution began to emanate outward from Britain in the 18th century, early capitalists adapted similar notions of productivity from farm fields to their mills and factories. As with growing crops, the key idea was to measure the amount of output produced given an amount of input, and then experiment with different processes for improving this value. A farmer cares about bushels per acre, while a factory owner might care about automobiles produced per paid hour of labor. A farmer improves their metric by using a smarter crop rotation system, while the factory owner might improve their metric by shifting production to a continuous motion assembly line. In these examples, different types of things are being produced, but the force driving changes in methods is the same: productivity. But then the knowledge sector emerged as a major force in the mid-20th century, and this profitable dependence on crisp, quantitative, formal notions of productivity all but vanished. There was, as it turns out, a good reason for this abandonment. The old notions of productivity that worked so well in farming and manufacturing didn't seem to apply to this new style of cognitive work. One problem is the variability of effort. In knowledge work, individuals are often wrangling complicated and constantly shifting workloads. You might be working on a client report at the same time that you're gathering testimonials for the company website and organizing an office party, all the while also updating a conflict of interest statement that Human Resources just emailed you about. In this setting, there's no clear single output to track. Another problem is a lack of clear systems to experiment on. In the knowledge sector, decisions about organizing and executing work are largely left up to individuals to figure out on their own. Companies might standardize the software that their employees use, but systems for assigning, managing, organizing, collaborating on, and ultimately executing tasks are left up to each individual. The knowledge worker cannot be supervised closely or in detail, argued Peter Drucker in his influential 1967 book, The Effective Executive. He can only be helped, but he must direct himself. These realities created a real problem for the emergent knowledge sector. Without concrete productivity metrics to measure and clear processes to improve, companies weren't clear how they should manage their employees. It was from this uncertainty that a simple alternative emerged, which I call pseudo-productivity, a management approach that uses visible activity as a crude proxy for actual productivity. When we talk about productivity, we are usually talking about pseudo-productivity, a constant, frantic busyness that signals to others that we're working hard, but that has little or no relation to how much valuable output we're actually producing. This is why John McPhee confused us. His behavior is alarming because it conflicts with the demands of pseudo-productivity. How can he just lie there? There's so much to do. And what would his colleagues think? But as we'll see next, our attachment to pseudo-productivity is why so many of us are starting to burn out. The fall of pseudo-productivity. In the late 1980s, IBM decided to introduce email to their headquarters in Armonk, New York. Because they're IBM, they decided that they would first conduct a detailed measurement study to determine just how much communication was already happening in their office. They measured calls, they measured voicemails, they measured memos, they even measured how often people would leave sticky notes on the desks of colleagues who weren't there when they stopped by to chat. Once they had measured everything that was going on in the office, they provisioned a sufficiently powerful mini-computer to handle all of it. This way, even if all communication moved to email, they would still have enough power to handle it. With these results in hand, they turned on the computer, and within 3 days, it broke down. In that vanishingly short period of time, the IBM employees began sending roughly 5 times more communication than they ever had before. This story captures a key insight. Pseudo-productivity was okay as the status quo throughout much of the 20th century. It wasn't particularly effective, but it wasn't particularly negative either. But then we get the front office IT revolution, and the problems begin. This is exactly what we saw at IBM. When activity for the sake of activity is what matters, what happens when you suddenly reduce the friction involved in the highly visible activity of sending and receiving messages? The amount of messages we send and receive suddenly jumps up. And then we end up more distracted, we end up more frenetic. This continued throughout the technology revolution that followed. Laptops brought work home. Smartphones brought work everywhere in between. One person must now constantly wage the internal battle of demonstrate more productivity versus everything else going on in their lives. This is frustrating and infuriating. Most people in desperation fell back on what I call the 20% rule, in which you keep accepting more work and showing more busyness until you have so much to do that your stress gives you emotional cover to start saying no. As a result, you always end up with around 20% too much on your plate, leaving you in a constant state of stress. So to summarize, pseudo-productivity combined with modern technology created the setting of overload and frantic busyness that is increasingly afflicting us today. We need a better alternative. Now I have one, and I call it slow productivity. In the lessons that now follow, I'll present 3 principles of slow productivity, and for each, offer a concrete strategy for how to put that principle into action.
Tired of AI hype without results? SAP Business AI isn't just talk. It's embedded across SAP solutions, driving immediate impact for your organization. From Joule, your digital assistant, to AI-powered capabilities throughout the SAP portfolio, SAP Business AI helps you make confident decisions based on your own data, all while maintaining the highest security and privacy standards for growth-focused businesses. Revolutionary technology, real-world results. That's SAP Business AI.
From the minds of visionaries to the desks of disruptors, I'm Lars Schmidt, host of the Redefining Work podcast. Join me each week as we explore the new world of work through the lens of those shaping it. CEOs, HR leaders, investors, and more. Be a part of the conversation that changes everything. Subscribe to Redefining Work today.
We all have those people on our gift lists who are hard to shop for because they're so freaking smart and efficient and they already have most everything they need. For me, those people are my sister Amanda and my brother Bronson. The two of them have world-class minds, which means it's a world-class pain in the butt trying to find a gift that will impress, delight, and stimulate them.
Well, here's an idea, Rufus. How about an executive membership to the Next Big Idea Club, right? Every quarter, noted brainiacs Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, Susan Cain, and Daniel Pink will handpick the 2 best nonfiction books, and they'll send them straight to the doors of your brother and sister, along with reading guides, invitations to exclusive author Q&As, pod classes like the one we're listening to from Cal Newport, bunch of other goodies.
That is a brilliant idea. That's exactly what I'm going to do. Listener, if you're looking for a gift for the readers in your life, the big thinkers, the nerds, the lifelong learners, the optimizers, visit nextbigideaclub.com and use the code podcast20 to take 20% off a gift subscription. That's code podcast20 at nextbigideaclub.com. There's also a link in our episode notes.
Help your loved ones live brighter in 2025. Visit nextbigideaclub.com.
Do fewer things. We begin with the first principle of slow productivity. Do fewer things. To better explain what this means, let's start with a story. In late October 1811, an advertisement in a London newspaper promoted a new novel by a lady. The author's name was not given, but in a subsequent advertisement appearing the next month, she was more specifically identified as Lady A. The book was Sense and Sensibility, and the pseudonymous author, of course, was Jane Austen. Austen had spent more than a decade working on a collection of manuscripts that she was now, seemingly all at once, polishing into impressive final forms. Sense and Sensibility initiated a remarkable 5-year run of publishing, arguably unmatched in the history of modern literature, that saw Austen soon after also release Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, and then, finally, in 1816, Emma. A year later, she died, at just 41 years old. A popular explanation for Austen's productivity is that she mastered the art of writing secretly, scribbling prose in bursts between the many distracting obligations of her social standing. The source of this idea was Austen's nephew, James, who in 1869, more than 50 years after Austen's death, published a gauzy Victorian biography of his aunt that helped expose her works to a broader audience. In Chapter 6 of this text, James provides the following memorable description.
How she was able to effect all this is surprising, for she had no separate study to retire to, and most of the work must have been done in the general sitting room, subject to all kinds of casual interruptions. She was careful that her occupation should not be suspected by servants or visitors or any persons beyond her own family party. She wrote upon small sheets of paper which could easily be put away or covered with a piece of blotting paper. There was, between the front door and the offices, a swing door which creaked when it was opened. But she objected to having this little inconvenience remedied because it gave her notice when anyone was coming.
This story of the aspiring but frustrated gentlewoman, surreptitiously plying her craft, could have come straight out of one of Austen's novels. Not surprisingly, given this pleasing symmetry, the myth stuck. If viewed through the lens of productivity, however, we must admit that James' portrayal of his aunt is disquieting. It seems to endorse a model of production in which better results require you to squeeze ever more work into your schedule. The obstacle standing between you and your own sense and sensibility, it implies, is a willingness to do more. Austen used small gaps between interminable social visits to write on scraps of paper in her sitting room. So why can't you wake up at 5 a.m. or make better use of your lunch hour? A closer look at Austen's life, however, soon reveals issues with her nephew's tales of secret writing. Modern biographies, drawing more extensively from primary source material, reveal that the real Jane Austen was not an exemplar of a grinded-out busyness, but instead a powerful example for something quite different, a slower approach to getting things done. After an early burst of productivity, when Austen was younger, she found herself constantly thwarted by the everyday busyness of her striving middle-class existence, unable to make progress on her work. Indeed, the world would have been denied Austen's brilliance if not for a fateful decision made in 1809 that swung the conditions for productivity dramatically back in Austen's favor. It was then that Austen, along with her mother, her sister Cassandra, and their family friend Martha Lloyd, settled into a modest cottage positioned at the crossroads of the sleepy town of Chawton. Critically for Austen's work, her family, wrung out from the complications and trials of their lives in the preceding years, embraced a much-needed respite by deciding to largely absent themselves from the social scene in Chawton. There were no dances and few dinners, writes one of Austen's biographers, and they remained largely withdrawn into their private activities. Hidden from the world at Chawton Cottage, suddenly, almost miraculously free of most responsibilities, both domestic and social, Austen, for the first time in over a decade, had gained real and meaningful space to think and work creatively. It's here, working at a modest writing desk by a window overlooking the road, that she finally finishes the manuscripts for Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice before moving on to compose Mansfield Park and Emma. Austen's nephew may have popularized the story of an overscheduled Austen, prim and proper in her sitting room, working in frenzied bursts between incessant distractions, but the reality of her remarkable years at Chawton are clearly quite different. Far from glamorizing a surreptitious, disciplined busyness, Austen's story, when told properly, seems to endorse the opposite. Austen was not able to produce creatively during the crowded periods of her life. It was only when, through circumstance and contrivance, that she enjoyed greatly reduced obligations, was Austen able, finally, to complete her best work. What is the key lesson from the Austen story? Doing fewer things at once increases the number of things you accomplish over time. It's like floating cut logs down a river. Send too many and they jam, and nothing makes it to the mill. So why does this happen? Well, in knowledge work, the answer can be found in what I call overhead tax. Everything you agree to do brings with it its own administrative obligations. Emails to send, questions to answer, meetings to attend. As you say yes to more things, these obligations add up. Soon, more and more of your day is spent dealing with this overhead instead of actually tackling the tasks themselves. Eventually, your ability to get almost anything done dissipates. The logs jam up in the river. The key to success in knowledge work without burning out is to keep the ratio of overhead tax to work reasonable. This is the sweet spot in which good work is done quickly, the range in which Austen finished 5 books in a handful of years. So here we get to a key conflict with the demands of pseudo-productivity. An embrace of busyness doesn't necessarily maximize what you accomplish. Doing fewer things can be, paradoxically, much more productive. Work at a natural pace. Let's continue now with the second principle of slow productivity. Work at a natural pace. To better explain what this means, it will help to first look backwards, all the way into our deep history. Humans in more or less our current modern form have walked the earth for roughly 300,000 years. For all but the last 10,000 or so of these many years, we lived as semi-nomadic hunters and gatherers. These timescales are sufficiently vast for natural selection to have adapted our bodies and brains toward an existence in which our experience of work was centered on foraging. When seeking to understand the friction points in contemporary office life, therefore, a good place to start might be to identify where our current work routines most differ from what our prehistoric ancestors evolved to expect. The problem with this approach, of course, is that there are no prehistoric humans left, and archaeological digs reveal only fragmentary glimpses into the realities of this past era. Fortunately, Modern anthropology has identified a partial solution to this issue. Study with care the dwindling number of existing communities that still rely largely on hunting and gathering for their sustenance. This is exactly what was undertaken in the recent work of a research team led by Mark Dybel, a lecturer in evolutionary anthropology at Cambridge University. As reported in a landmark 2019 paper appearing in the journal Nature Human Behavior, Dybel and his team observed the Aita of the northern Philippines, a community well suited for the comparison of different models of food acquisition, as some of them still largely depended on hunting and gathering, while others had recently shifted toward rice farming. Both groups shared the same culture and environment, allowing a cleaner comparison between the two food acquisition strategies. Dybel's team deployed the experience sampling method, in which, at randomly generated intervals, the researchers record what their subjects are doing at that exact moment. The goal was to calculate, for both the farmers and the foragers, the relative proportion of samples dedicated to leisure versus work activities. The group engaged entirely in foraging spent 40 to 50% of daylight hours at leisure, Dybel told me when I asked him to summarize his team's results, versus more like 30% for those who are engaged entirely in farming. His data validates the claim that hunter-gatherers enjoy more leisure time than farmers. Missing from these high-level numbers, however, is an equally important observation: how this leisure time was distributed throughout the day. As Dybel explained, while the farmers engaged in monotonous, continuous work, the pace of the forager schedule was more varied, with long respites interspersed throughout their daily efforts. Hunting trips required a long hike through the forest, so you'd be out all day, but you'd have breaks, Dybel told me. With something like fishing, there are spikes, ups and downs. Only a small percent of their time is spent actually fishing. For our purposes, the key observation from Dybel's study is this idea that for most of history, humans' experience of work involved great variation of intensity on multiple timescales. Even after the rise of agriculture, monotonous days harvesting in the fall might be balanced by long periods of quiet inactivity in the winter. Variation was part and parcel of work until the Industrial Revolution picked up steam, so to speak, in the 18th century. The economics of mills and then factories introduced, for the first time in human history, the idea of undifferentiated labor, every day, all year long. The workers eventually fought back against this grim situation. They pushed for reform legislation, like the Federal Labor Standards Act, passed by the U.S. Congress in 1938, that fixed 40 hours as the standard work week, limiting the fraction of the day that could be snared in monotonous effort without extra pay. They also formed labor unions as a counterbalance to the more dehumanizing aspects of industrialization. If we were going to lock our days into activities that alienated us from our basic nature, we wanted, to the extent possible, to make sure we were doing so on our own terms. But then knowledge work entered the scene. As discussed, the managerial class didn't know how to handle the autonomy and variety of jobs in this new sector. Their stopgap response was pseudo-productivity, which used visible activity as a proxy for usefulness. Under this new configuration, we took another step backward. As in the industrial sector, we continued to work all day, every day, without seasonal changes, as any such variation would be perceived as non-productivity. But unlike the industrial sector, in this invisible factory we'd constructed for ourselves, we didn't have reform legislation or unions to identify the most draining aspects of this arrangement and fight for limits. Knowledge work was free to totalize our existence, colonizing as much of our time, from evenings to weekends to vacations, as we could bear, and leaving little recourse beyond burnout or demotion or quitting when it became too much. Our estrangement from the rhythms of work that dominated the first 280,000 years of our species' existence was now complete. We might be used to the idea of never varying work, but underneath our modern veneer, it's slowly wearing us down. Our human essence, forged over millennia of evolution, know there's a better, more natural way to work, a more natural pace. Embrace slower seasons. Georgia O'Keeffe's professional life got off to a busy start. In 1908, at the age of 21, having studied with award-winning success at both the Art Institute of Chicago and the Art Students League in New York City, O'Keeffe ran out of money, leading her to take a job in Chicago as a commercial artist. In 1910, she moved with her family to Virginia, where she began teaching art at multiple institutions. Between 1912 to 1914, she went west, teaching art in public schools in the dusty Texas panhandle town of Amarillo. During the summer, she returned east to act as a teaching assistant at Columbia University's Teachers College, while also taking courses at the University of Virginia. By 1915, she had an instructor role at Columbia College in South Carolina. Then she was back in New York at the Teachers College. In 1916, she became the chair of the art department at West Texas State Normal College in Canyon, Texas. Even just listing O'Keeffe's resume during this period is tiring. Living it must have been downright exhausting. Somehow, throughout these years of hustle, O'Keeffe managed, off and on, to keep studying and developing her emerging abstract artistic style. But these efforts weren't easy. She would take long breaks from art, including one early in her career that lasted nearly 4 years. It was clear that something about this overloaded lifestyle would need to change before O'Keeffe could unlock her staggering artistic potential. Fortunately, in 1918, that change finally came in the form of a rambling rural property located in the southern tip of the Adirondacks on the western shore of Lake George. The land was owned by the family of Alfred Stieglitz, an acclaimed photographer and owner of the influential 291 Gallery in New York City. Stieglitz came to know O'Keeffe after exhibiting a collection of her innovative charcoal works at his gallery. A friendship began that would eventually transform into a romance and, finally, marriage. Stieglitz's family had purchased their estate on Lake George, which they called Oak Lawn, in the 1880s. Alfred grew up spending summers at Oak Lawn. "The lake is perhaps my oldest friend," he once wrote. "Gosh, what days and nights we've had together, calm, beautiful hours, mad, static ones, dream hours, hours and days of quiet wonder." Stieglitz was excited to introduce O'Keeffe to these days of quiet wonder. Starting in 1918, he began bringing her to his family's estate during the summer. The first 2 years, they stayed in the property's stately mansion, but after the Stieglitz family sold that parcel, they relocated to a humbler farmhouse situated on a nearby hilltop. It's here that O'Keeffe found the space to fully activate her creativity. She developed a pastoral routine where she would walk each morning into Lake George Village for her mail. Sometimes she would extend these walks by hiking the 2-mile trail to Prospect Mountain, where she would be rewarded with a sweeping view of the steamers working up and down the long lake. More than anything else, however, she painted. Between 1918 and 1934, largely working out of her shanty, an outbuilding on the farm that she converted into a studio, O'Keeffe produced over 200 paintings, in addition to numerous sketches and pastel works. She took the natural scenery around her as inspiration, capturing both grand views of the lake and the surrounding mountains and close-up studies of trees and flowers. In the fall, she would bring her canvases back from the Adirondacks to the city to finish and exhibit. Her nature-inspired abstractions were acclaimed, and O'Keeffe became a celebrity in the art world. The Lake George years are considered to be the most prolific period of her career. Georgia O'Keeffe found a smart strategy for reconnecting with our natural affinity for variation and work pace. She purposefully introduced seasonality back into her own work, creating summers that had a different pace and purpose than the rest of the year. Far from slowing her down, this seasonality unlocked massively valuable new output. So here we find a concrete strategy for putting our second principle of slow productivity into action. Follow O'Keeffe's lead and add your own seasonality into your work. This strategy has 2 benefits. 1, you'll produce more and higher quality output in the long run. And 2, your work will be more sustainable and meaningful. Now, if you work for yourself, you can just make this happen. One entrepreneur I interviewed decided that she wouldn't work in July or August. Going forward, she simply just added that caveat to her contracts. There was no one to stop her. If you work for someone else, however, seasonality might take some more effort. But most people can probably quiet quit for a month or so each year, meaning you simply work less hard for a limited period of time. No major announcements or fancy new systems are required here. You're instead just quietly adjusting your effort up and down. Modern knowledge work wants you to work all out all the time. It's up to you to push back and find a more natural pace.
You just heard a special preview of Cal Newport's Slow Productivity Podclass. To hear 3 more lessons from Cal, visit bookoftheday.nextbigideaclub.com or just search for Book of the Day Substack and become a paid member.
And once you've done that, you will not only get access to our full archive of posts, Cal's podcast, you'll also get summaries of brand new books written and read by the authors themselves, delivered to your inbox every morning.
I look forward to it each morning. This is where I discover a lot of the books that we end up featuring on this weekly podcast.
True.
And it's, again, bookoftheday.nextbigideaclub.com.
And if you follow the link in the episode notes, you get a special discount. Today's episode was engineered by Mike Toda, sound design by Corey Barton. Next Big Idea is a proud member of the LinkedIn Podcast Network. I'm Caleb Bissinger.
And I'm Rufus Griscom. See you next week.